Welcome to our explainer. Today, we're diving into a theological concept that, I gotta say, might sound a little surprising, maybe even impossible at first, but it actually has some deep roots in biblical interpretation. We're talking about infant faith.
So let's just get right to it. Here's the big question. Can a baby, an infant, who can't talk or think in abstract terms, actually have faith in God? I mean, that question alone really challenges how most of us think about what faith even is.
Well, the argument we're exploring today comes back with a really clear yes. And not only is it possible, but within this particular theological framework, it's actually seen as the normal, expected thing for children who are born into a community of faith. To really understand this, we've got to start where the argument itself begins, and that's in the Old Testament. Specifically, we're heading to the Psalms of King David. Okay, check out this verse. In what is a really personal and raw psalm, David says something pretty stunning. He says God made him trust while he was a nursing infant. Think about that. He's not pointing to a decision he made as a teenager. He's tracing his faith all the way back to the very beginning of his life. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, isn't this whole psalm a prophecy about Jesus? And that's a common and important reading. But the source material we're looking at says, wait a minute. The argument is that it's both. Yes, it's absolutely a prophecy about Christ, but it's also David's own story about his own life. You can't just slice it up and say this part is for David and that part is for Jesus. It's meant to be both at the same time. So how could David even think like this? Well, he was seeing his own infancy through the lens of God's covenant promise. And that promise, way back in Genesis, specifically includes children. It doesn't say God will be their God once they're old enough to understand. It says he is their God, right from the start, them and their descendants after them. And this is such a key point. Psalm 22 wasn't David's private diary, It was part of Israel's public hymn book. They sang this stuff together in worship. And by doing that, it kind of frames this idea of infant faith, not as some weird, one-off thing that only happened to David, but as the normal, expected way for a child to grow up in the community.
All right, so let's jump forward now into the New Testament, because this idea of children having a real spiritual connection to God, well, it doesn't just show up. It gets developed in a big way by Jesus himself.
The first piece of evidence is pretty wild. It's John the Baptist. While he's still in his mother's womb, he leaps for joy because Jesus, also in his mother's womb, is nearby. Proponents of this view look at that and say, see, this is proof positive that an infant, even a fetus, can have a spiritual relationship and sense the presence of God. But here's where Jesus really flips the script on everyone. He doesn't say, hey kids, you need to grow up and get a sophisticated adult-like faith. He says the complete opposite. He tells the adults they need to become like little children, with that simple, dependent trust they have. He makes children the role models for every believer. And then he says this, which might be the most direct statement on the topic in the whole Bible. He doesn't beat around the bush. He talks about these little ones who believe in me. He puts those two ideas right next to each other, little ones and believe. And the source material argues that the kid he was using as an example wasn't some special case, but was representing all the children in the community. Luke's gospel even adds a little detail, saying that some of the kids brought to Jesus were actual infants. And what does Jesus do? He blesses them. So this leads to a really powerful question. In the Bible, blessings like this are meant to be received by faith. So why would Jesus perform an act that requires faith on someone who is supposedly incapable of having it? His action seems to assume they can receive it.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the biblical evidence, but what are we actually talking about here? What does infant faith really look like? Let's try and get a clear definition. All right, so there's a technical term for this, paedofaith. And the core idea is pretty simple. It's a foundational trust, a real relationship with God that's there from the start of life. Now, it's not the same as a theologian's complex, articulated belief system, but the argument is that it's the same kind of faith. That core element of trust, it just differs in its level of maturity.
This is a great way to see the difference. Mature faith is often broken down into three parts. Knowing things, agreeing that they're true, and then trusting. Well, infant faith zeroes in on that last, most fundamental part, relational trust. The best analogy, really, is a baby's complete and total trust in its parent.
And honestly, this is the analogy that makes the whole idea click for a lot of people. Think about it. An infant knows its mother. It's not a factual knowledge, right? The baby can't tell you any facts about her, but it is a deep, personal, relational knowledge. The baby knows her voice, her smell, her touch, and the argument is that an infant's relationship with God works in that same kind of pre-verbal, deeply personal way.
Okay, so this is a really fascinating theological idea. But so what? Does this actually change anything? Does it have any real-world impact? Let's take a look. Well, according to our source, the impact is actually huge. For one, it changes parenting. Children aren't seen as little outsiders who need to be converted someday, but as members of the community from day one who need to be nurtured in the faith they already have. Second, it shifts the view of baptism. It's not about creating faith, but about being a sign that recognizes and formalizes a relationship that's already there. And third, it provides immense pastoral comfort for parents who tragically lose a child in infancy, giving them a strong reason to hope they will see that child again.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. If faith, at its very core, starts not with a list of facts you have to agree with, but with simple relational trust, like a child's, what does that mean for how all of us live out a life of faith, no matter how old we are? Thanks for digging into this with us.